Myanmar, known for centuries as the Golden Land, a country of glittering pagodas, endless rivers, and mountains draped in mist. To the outside world, Myanmar has often been a mystery, closed off, little understood, yet filled with stories that have shaped Southeast Asia for thousands of years. Geography is destiny, they say, and nowhere is that clearer than here. Myanmar sits at the crossroads of India, China, and Southeast Asia. To the west, the towering ranges of the Himalayas guard the frontier. To the east, dense jungles spill into Laos and Thailand. To the south, the Irrawaddy River fans into a wide delta that opens onto the Andaman Sea. This landscape has always defined the fate of the people who live here. It made Myanmar a natural bridge between worlds, and sometimes a battlefield caught in the struggles of greater powers. But Myanmar is not just defined by its geography, it is defined by its people, over 100 distinct ethnic groups, each with its own traditions, its own language, its own vision of what this land should be. Together, they created one of the most culturally diverse countries in Asia. Yet this diversity has also been a source of tension, shaping the course of Myanmar's history through cycles of unity and division. Religion, too, has left its mark. For over 1,000 years, Theravada Buddhism has been the beating heart of Burmese culture. Golden stupas rise above cities and villages alike, their spires catching the sun at dawn and dusk. Monasteries serve not only as places of prayer, but also as centers of education and community life. At the same time, Myanmar's story is also one of religious layers, animist traditions that predate Buddhism, Hindu myths carried from India, Islamic influences arriving through trade, and Christian missions during colonial times. When we talk about the early history of Myanmar, we step into a crossroads of civilizations. Long before the name Myanmar or Burma was ever spoken, the Irrawaddy Valley was home to small but vibrant cultures. The first among them were the Pew city-states. Between the 2nd century BCE and the 9th century CE, the Pew built fortified cities like Sriketra and Halen, connected by trade routes that stretched into India and China. These early city-states absorbed influences from their powerful neighbors. From India came Theravada, Buddhism, along with scripts, art styles, and political models. From China came trade goods and diplomatic recognition. The Pew were known as peaceful people, cultivating rice, building irrigation systems, and leaving behind inscriptions that reveal a highly organized society. For centuries, they stood as cultural mediators between the great civilizations surrounding them. But the Pew were not alone. To the south, the Mon people thrived in Lower Burma. Their kingdom, centered around Thaton, developed close ties with India and became an early hub for Theravada Buddhism. The Mon left an enduring legacy. They were master builders, spreading religious architecture and laying the foundations of Burmese written culture. Their script influenced what would later become Burmese writing, and their monasteries kept alive the polycanon of Buddhist teachings. By the 9th century, however, the Pew world was shaken. Raids by the Nanzhao kingdom from the Yunnan region in China devastated the Pew cities. The once flourishing civilization declined, leaving behind ruins that today are UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Out of this collapse, new powers began to rise. One of those powers came from the north, the Burma people, migrating down from the eastern Himalayas. They settled in the dry zone of central Myanmar, near the confluence of trade routes. By the mid-9th century, they founded the city of Pagan, also known as Bagan. At first, Pagan was just one kingdom among many, competing with Mon principalities to the south and Shan states to the north. But Pagan had something that gave it an advantage: location. It stood in the heart of the Irrawaddy Valley, where fertile lands could feed armies and merchants could connect across Asia. Slowly, Pagan grew in power. The turning point came in the 11th century, under King Anarata, often called the Father of Burma. Anarata unified much of the Irrawaddy Valley and launched campaigns that extended Pagan's reach. He conquered the Mon kingdom of Thaton in 1057, bringing back monks, scriptures, and artisans. With this, Theravada Buddhism became the state religion of Pagan, shaping the cultural soul of Myanmar for centuries to come. Anarata was not just a conqueror, he was a builder. Under his rule, and that of his successors, Pagan entered a golden age of temple construction. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, more than 10,000 temples, stupas, and monasteries were built across the Pagan plain. Even today, about 2,000 survive, creating one of the most breathtaking archaeological landscapes in the world. Each temple told a story. Some were massive, like the Ananda Temple, a masterpiece of Buddhist architecture filled with exquisite carvings and statues. Others were modest shrines built by farmers or local officials, testifying to the widespread devotion of the people. Collectively, these temples created a skyline of faith, a visible symbol of a society bound together by religion. But Pagan was not only about faith, it was also about administration. Kings of Pagan developed a system of land management that granted religious institutions large tracts of farmland. Monasteries became centers of both spiritual and economic power. This close bond between the monarchy and the Buddhist Sangha would become a recurring theme throughout Myanmar's history. Pagan also became a hub for cultural fusion. Indian influences remained strong, but local traditions gave Burmese Buddhism its own unique character. Art, literature, and language flourished. Pagan became known as a seat of learning, where monks debated philosophy and scholars copied sacred texts. For nearly 250 years, the Pagan Empire stood as the dominant power in mainland Southeast Asia. Its reach extended into modern-day Thailand, Laos, and Yunnan. Its legacy was not measured in territory alone, but in the cultural foundations it laid. The widespread adoption of Theravada Buddhism, the creation of a Burmese script, and the vision of a unified kingdom under a Burmese monarch. By the late 13th century, however, Pagan's strength began to wane. The enormous wealth devoted to temple building drained the royal treasury. Local lords and religious institutions gained too much autonomy. When Mongol forces under Kublai Khan advanced into the region in the 1280s, Pagan could not resist effectively. The city fell, and the great empire dissolved into smaller kingdoms. Yet Pagan's fall was not the end of Burmese civilization. It was a rebirth. The memory of Pagan, its temples standing in silent testimony, remained the spiritual heart of Myanmar. Even centuries later, kings and generals would look back to Pagan as the model of unity and power. And so, from the Pew and Mon legacies, and through the golden age of Pagan, the foundations of Myanmar's identity were laid. A land bound to Buddhism, proud of its cultural achievements, and destined to rise and fall in cycles of unity and fragmentation. When Pagan fell at the end of the 13th century, it left behind more than just ruined temples. It left a vacuum of power. For 2.5 centuries, Pagan had given the Irrawaddy Valley a sense of unity. Now, with its collapse, the land fractured into a patchwork of rival states, each vying for dominance. The cause of Pagan's decline was not a single event, but a chain of pressures. By the 1200s, the kingdom was already strained. Too much land had been donated to monasteries, eroding the royal treasury. Local lords, or Myosa, were growing increasingly independent. Then came the Mongol invasions under Kublai Khan. In 1287, Pagan could not resist. The Mongols sacked the city, and though they did not remain long, the damage was done. Pagan's golden age was over. In its place arose a mosaic of powers. To the north, the Shan peoples gained ground. Migrating down from Yunnan, the Shan established a series of fortified states in the highlands. They became fierce rivals, sometimes allies, of the Burmese kingdoms that tried to re-emerge in the lowlands. Their warrior traditions and mountain strongholds made them difficult to subdue. For centuries, the Shan states remained a persistent force in Myanmar's politics. In central Burma, attempts were made to restore unity. The Kingdom of Ava, founded in 1364, became the successor state to Pagan. Situated on the Irrawaddy, near modern-day Mandalay, Ava was well positioned to control trade and farmland. For a time it looked as though the Burmese might restore the grandeur of Pagan. The kings of Ava built a courtly culture, patronized the arts, and tried to assert authority over the fractious Shan states. But Ava's power was never absolute. The Shan resisted subjugation, and the Mon to the south pursued their own ambitions. The kingdom of Hanthawaddy, centered in the Mon city of Pegu, today's Bago, emerged as a powerful maritime state in the 14th century. With access to the sea and strong trade links to Sri Lanka and India, Hanthawaddy became a beacon of Theravada Buddhist culture. Mon monks and scholars revitalized Buddhism throughout Southeast Asia, and the kingdom became a respected spiritual center. For nearly 2 centuries, Ava and Hanthawaddy vied for dominance, the Burmese heartland in the north against the Mon coastal power in the south. Periods of war alternated with uneasy truces. Neither side could decisively conquer the other, and the land remained divided. In the 16th century, another force rose to prominence, the Taungoo dynasty. Originating from a small principality southeast of Ava, Taungoo would eventually forge the largest empire in Myanmar's history. But in these centuries of fragmentation, it was the constant push and pull of Ava, Shan, and Hanthawaddy that shaped the political map. This era of division was not only about wars and shifting borders, it was also a time of cultural crosscurrents. Shan chiefs brought new military strategies, Mon scholars influenced the religious and literary life of the Burmese court, trade routes expanded, linking Myanmar more deeply into regional commerce. Still, instability had its costs. The Irrawaddy Valley, once the beating heart of Pagan's empire, often became a battleground. Cities rose and fell, kings were crowned and dethroned, and ordinary people lived under the uncertainty of shifting rulers. Yet out of this turbulence emerged a tradition of resilience. Burmese culture did not fade, it adapted, incorporating influences from Shan Mon and others into a uniquely Burmese identity. By the late 15th century, the balance began to shift. Ava weakened under constant Shan attacks, and Hanthawaddy enjoyed a period of prosperity under King Dhammasadi, one of Myanmar's most remarkable rulers. Dhammasadi sponsored Buddhist reform, sending monks to Sri Lanka and reaffirming the Theravada tradition. Under his reign, Hanthawaddy shone as a center of religion and learning, while Ava's fortunes declined. But just when it seemed the Man might dominate the land, new tides of change were coming. From Taungoo, a small but ambitious dynasty would rise, inheriting the lessons of centuries of division. They would use military innovation, strategic alliances, and sheer ambition to build an empire greater than Pagan had ever achieved. The centuries after Pagan's fall were a time of fragmentation, but they were also a crucible testing the resilience of Myanmar's peoples, shaping their cultural identity, and setting the stage for the dramatic rise of Taungoo. The age of division was ending. The age of empire was about to begin. Out of the chaos of fragmentation, when Ava and Hanthawaddy were locked in endless rivalry and the Shan chiefs carved out their mountain strongholds, no one could have predicted that a small, obscure principality would rise to dominate nearly all of mainland Southeast Asia. Yet that is exactly what happened. The Taungoo dynasty, born in a town far from the centers of power, would build the largest empire Myanmar has ever known. The story begins in the early 16th century, in the small settlement of Taungoo. Situated southeast of Ava, Taungoo was a frontier outpost, overshadowed by its larger neighbors. But its location gave it a certain advantage. It lay just far enough away from the centers of conflict to grow quietly, while still being connected to trade and migration routes. In 1510, Mingi Nayo, the ruler of Taungoo, declared his independence from Ava. At first, this was little more than a bold gesture. Ava was in decline, and its kings could no longer control their vassals. Taungoo survived on the margins, biding its time. But Mingi Nayo's successors were far more ambitious. The true architect of Taungoo's greatness was Tabin Chwethi, who ruled from 1530 to 1550. Seeing the weakness of the once mighty Hanthawaddy kingdom in the south, he launched an audacious campaign. In 1539, Tabin Chwethi captured Pegu, the Mon capital. With that victory, he gained not only territory, but also access to the wealth of maritime trade. The Mon lands were rich, connected to global commerce through ports that welcomed traders from India, Sri Lanka, and beyond. Tabin Chwethi understood that wealth and manpower were just as important as military victories. By absorbing Hanthawaddy, he gave Taungoo the resources it needed to grow from a frontier state into a serious contender for power. He adopted Mon culture, patronized their scholars and monks, and positioned himself as the ruler of both Burmese and Mon subjects. For the first time in centuries, North and South were united under a single throne. But Tabin Chwethi's ambitions did not end there. He dreamed of conquering all of Burma and beyond. Campaigns against Arakan in the west and Siam in the east tested Taungoo's strength. Though not always successful, they signaled the dynasty's determination to expand. Tabin Chwethi's reign came to a tragic end in 1550 when he was assassinated. Yet his legacy lived on through his general and brother-in-law, and it was Bayanon who would transform Taungoo from a kingdom into an empire. Bayanon, who reigned from 1550 to 1581, is remembered as Myanmar's greatest conqueror. Known as the Conqueror of 10 Directions, he built one of the largest empires in Southeast Asian history. His campaigns stretched far and wide. He subdued the Shan states, captured Chiang Mai in northern Thailand, and forced Ayutthaya, the great Siamese kingdom, to become a vassal. He extended Burmese influence into Laos and parts of Cambodia, creating an empire that rivaled the reach of pagans centuries earlier. What made Bainon's conquests possible was not just military might, but also organization. He introduced a system of governance that demanded loyalty from vassal kings, while allowing them some autonomy. This balance of control and flexibility helped keep the empire together, at least for a time. Bainon also left a lasting cultural legacy. He reformed the Buddhist Sangha, enforcing orthodoxy and suppressing practices he considered heretical. His reign reinforced Theravada Buddhism as the unifying faith of the Burmese world. Temples were restored, inscriptions carved, and monks supported. In many ways, Bainon cast himself as the defender of the faith, a king whose military power served a higher spiritual purpose. But even the greatest conquerors cannot escape the realities of empire. After Bainon's death in 1581, the Taungoo Empire began to unravel. The empire was too large, too diverse, and too reliant on his personal authority. Vassal states broke away, rebellions flared, and Ayutthaya reasserted its independence. By the early 17th century, the first Taungoo Empire had collapsed, yet the dynasty was not finished. A restored Taungoo kingdom emerged, centered in Ava once again. This second phase of Taungoo rule, while less expansive, focused on consolidation. Kings like Anak Patlan worked to bring stability back to the heartland, reigning in local lords and restoring central authority. The restored Taungoo dynasty endured into the 18th century, though its power was diminished compared to Bainon's glory days. It laid the groundwork for the next great Burmese dynasty, the Konbaung, which would rise in the mid-18th century. The Taungoo era was thus a turning point. It demonstrated the heights of Burmese ambition and the limits of imperial overreach. It showed how a small, peripheral state could rise to dominate a region, but also how fragile such power could be without lasting institutions to support it. For Myanmar's history, the Taungoo legacy is profound. Bainon's empire may not have lasted, but his vision of a united and powerful Burma inspired generations. His campaigns and reforms shaped the political culture, and his image as the conqueror of 10 directions remains etched in the Burmese imagination. From the ruins of Pagan's fragmentation, the Taungoo had built an empire, and though that empire would fall, it paved the way for the Konbaung dynasty, a house that would lead Myanmar into its final chapters as an independent kingdom before the colonial age. The 18th century was a time of rebirth for Myanmar. Out of the ashes of the declining Taungoo state, a new dynasty rose, one that would both restore Burmese pride and set the stage for its eventual downfall. This was the Konbaung dynasty, the last royal house to rule an independent Myanmar. Its story is one of ambition and energy, but also of miscalculation and fate, as the kingdom collided with the rising power of European empires. It all began in the 1750s, in a small village called Moksoba. Here, a village chief named Aung launched a rebellion against the Mon, at that time dominated Lower Burma. Aung was no king. He was a man of humble background, but also extraordinary charisma and determination. Within a few years, he gathered a following and began to push the Mon armies back. By 1757, he had captured Pegu, the Mon capital, crushing Mon power and proclaiming himself king. Thus, the Konbaung dynasty was born. Aung was more than a military leader. He was a unifier. His campaigns consolidated much of Upper and Lower Burma, bringing together peoples long divided by war. He rebuilt towns, restored Buddhist monasteries, and founded a new capital at Shwiba. His rise was meteoric, but tragically short-lived. In 1760, during a campaign against Siam, Aung fell ill and died, leaving the throne to his sons. Yet his legacy endured. He had rekindled the vision of a powerful, united Burmese kingdom. His successors carried that vision forward. The most famous among them was King Shinbushan, Aung's son, who reigned from 1763 to 1776. Under his leadership, Burma reached new heights of military power. In 1767, Shinbushan's armies sacked Ayutthaya, the Siamese capital. The destruction was so complete that it marked the end of one of Southeast Asia's greatest kingdoms. For a brief moment, Burma stood as the undisputed power of the region. But constant warfare came at a cost. Burma's campaigns stretched its resources thin, fighting Siam, defending against Chinese invasions from Yunnan, and suppressing revolts drained the treasury and the people's strength. Still, the Konbaung dynasty endured, cycling through kings who balanced conquest with consolidation. Culturally, this was a period of revival. The Konbaung kings patronized Buddhism, sponsoring grand monasteries and religious scholarship. They also cultivated the arts. Literature, music, and dance flourished at court. Ava, the royal capital for much of this period, became a center of learning and culture. At the same time, the kings pursued a strict policy of control, ensuring that the Buddhist Sangha remained loyal to the throne. By the early 19th century, however, new challenges were on the horizon. European powers were expanding their influence in Asia. To the west, the British East India Company had already conquered Bengal and was pushing steadily eastward. To the south, the French were establishing themselves in Indochina. Burma, proud and independent, found itself caught between these growing empires. The first major clash came in 1824. King Bagida, a grandson of Aung Empire, had inherited the throne and pursued ambitious campaigns in Assam and Manipur territories bordering British India. The British saw this expansion as a threat to their own frontier. Tensions escalated, and in 1824, the First Anglo-Burmese War erupted. The war was disastrous for Burma. Though Burmese soldiers fought bravely, they were no match for British firepower and naval superiority. For the first time, the Burmese faced an industrialized European army, armed with modern weapons. After 2 years of fighting, Burma was forced to sign the Treaty of Yundabo in 1826. The terms were humiliating. Burma ceded Assam, Manipur, Arakan, and Tenasserim to the British. It also paid a massive indemnity, bankrupting the royal treasury. The defeat shocked the Konbaung court. For centuries, Burma had been a dominant regional power. Now, it had been humbled by a foreign force. The monarchy struggled to recover, but the loss of territory and prestige could not be undone. Still, the Konbaung kings did not give up. Under King Mindon Min, who ruled from 1853 to 1878, Burma experienced a renaissance of sorts. Mindon was a reformer. He moved the capital to Mandalay, which he built into a magnificent royal city. He sponsored a revival of Buddhism, convening the Fifth Buddhist Council, and carving the entire Pali Canon onto hundreds of marble slabs of feet, still visible today at the Kuthador Pagoda. Mindon also recognized the need to modernize. He introduced reforms to streamline administration, encouraged local industry, and even sought to establish contact with Western powers on equal terms. But modernization was limited, and the pressure from Britain never relented. The Second Anglo-Burmese War broke out in 1852, sparked by disputes over trade and British demands for greater access. Once again, Burma was defeated, losing Lower Burma including the vital port of Rangoon. The loss was crippling. With Rangoon under British control, Burma lost its main outlet to the sea. The kingdom was landlocked and economically weakened. Mindon tried to preserve what remained, balancing tradition with reform, but the writing was on the wall. When he died in 1878, his son, King Thiba, inherited a throne already under siege. Thiba was young, inexperienced, and ill-prepared to face the growing power of Britain. Court intrigues and brutal purges further weakened his position. In 1885, the British launched the Third Anglo-Burmese War. This time, the conflict lasted only weeks. British troops marched into Mandalay, dethroned King Thiba, and sent him into exile in India. The Konbaung dynasty, and with it, centuries of Burmese monarchy, came to an end. The fall of Mandalay was more than a military defeat, it was a cultural catastrophe. For the Burmese people, the king was not only a political ruler, but also a religious protector, a guardian of Buddhism itself. With his exile, the sacred order of the world seemed broken. The loss was deeply felt, and the memory of it still echoes in Myanmar's collective identity. And so, the Konbaung dynasty ended. It had risen from a village rebellion to command empires. It had burned Ayutthaya and defied China. It had built Mandalay and preserved Buddhism, but it could not withstand the tide of industrial imperialism. The golden palaces of Mandalay were looted. The monarchy was dismantled, and Burma was now a colony of Britain. The Konbaung kings left behind a paradoxical legacy. On the one hand, symbols of strength, culture, and unity. On the other, the tragic reminder that even the mightiest kingdom could fall to the relentless march of empire. From this moment onward, Myanmar would no longer be the master of its own destiny. It was entering a new chapter, one written under colonial rule. The year was 1885. In Mandalay, the golden palace of the Konbaung king stood silent. King Thiba, the last monarch of Burma, had been dethroned and sent into exile in India. For the first time in over 1,000 years, Burma had no king, no dynasty, no royal protector of Buddhism. The British flag now flew over the Irrawaddy Valley. Burma, once a proud empire, had become a colony. The British annexation of Upper Burma was swift, but its impact was profound. At first, the new rulers presented themselves as bringers of order and progress. Rangoon, already in British hands since the Second Anglo-Burmese War, was transformed into the colonial capital. The city became a bustling port, its streets lined with British administrative buildings, merchants' warehouses, and grand churches. For the British, Rangoon was a gateway to Asia. For the Burmese, it was a constant reminder of their lost sovereignty. Economically, colonial rule changed Burma beyond recognition. The British turned the fertile Irrawaddy Delta into a rice bowl for the empire. Vast tracts of land were cleared, canals dug, and railways built to transport crops to Rangoon's port. Burmese rice was exported across Asia, making Burma one of the world's largest rice exporters by the early 20th century. But the profits did not stay in Burma. British companies, Indian moneylenders, and foreign merchants reaped the benefits, while many Burmese farmers fell into debt. The British also exploited other resources. Teak forests in Upper Burma were logged on a massive scale. Oil wells in Yenonyong were tapped by British companies. Mines for rubies and precious stones were developed under colonial control. Burma became deeply integrated into the global capitalist economy, but ordinary Burmese saw little of the wealth. Socially, colonialism brought new divisions. The British favored Indian and Chinese immigrants for administrative and commercial roles. Rangoon became a cosmopolitan city, with large communities of Indians, Chinese, Armenians, and Europeans. The Burmese majority often felt marginalized in their own land, excluded from many economic opportunities. Resentment grew as foreigners seemed to prosper, while the Burmese struggled. The role of Buddhism also changed dramatically. With no king to act as patron, the Sangha Myanmar's community of monks lost much of its traditional support. British officials, skeptical of religion, tried to separate church and state. But monasteries remained central to Burmese life, becoming not just spiritual centers, but also quiet hubs of resistance. Monks preserved Burmese identity and culture in the face of foreign domination. Education, too, was transformed. The British introduced Western-style schools, teaching in English rather than Burmese. While this created a small elite fluent in the language of the colonizers, it also alienated many ordinary people. Traditional monastic schools, once the backbone of Burmese learning, struggled to keep up. Education became a tool of both opportunity and inequality. As decades passed, resentment boiled into nationalism. The first stirrings came from Buddhist monks, who organized to defend their religion and culture. In the early 20th century, lay people joined the movement. Associations like the Young Men's Buddhist Association sprang up, modeled partly on Western organizations, but driven by Burmese pride. Newspapers in Burmese began to circulate, spreading nationalist ideas. By the 1920s, a new generation was rising. Students, writers, and activists demanded more autonomy. Strikes and protests became common, especially against Indian moneylenders and British businesses. The Siasan Rebellion of 1930 to 1932, though crushed by the British, reflected deep rural discontent. Farmers, burdened by debt and high taxes, rallied under Siasan, who claimed the mantle of a righteous Buddhist king. His rebellion failed, but it showed the intensity of Burmese anger. The 1930s were turbulent years. The Great Depression hit Burma hard, collapsing rice prices and plunging farmers into deeper poverty. Communism and socialism began to spread among students and intellectuals, and in 1937, Burma was formally separated from British India, becoming its own colony under direct British rule. The move was meant to weaken nationalist movements, but instead it strengthened them. Now Burma's activists focused squarely on independence. One of the most influential leaders to emerge in this period was Aung San, a young student who would later become the father of modern Burma. Charismatic, determined, and politically astute, Aung San embodied the hopes of a generation that dreamed of freedom. By the eve of World War II, Burmese nationalism had become a powerful force that the British could no longer ignore. Colonial rule had reshaped Burma in every way. Cities like Rangoon and Mandalay had new skylines, dotted with colonial buildings. Railways and telegraph lines connected distant regions. Rice fields stretched wider than ever before, feeding global markets. But beneath this veneer of progress lay deep wounds: the loss of sovereignty, the marginalization of Burmese culture, and the economic struggles of farmers and workers. By 1939, Burma stood at a crossroads. On the surface, it was a colony of the British Empire, but beneath, the people were restless, their pride wounded, their nationalism burning brighter every year. The next storm World War II would shake the foundations of colonial rule and open the door to independence. By the late 1930s, Burma was a colony simmering with resentment. The British had transformed its economy and society, but they had also stripped the Burmese of sovereignty and pride. Students marched, monks preached resistance, and new leaders were rising. One of them was a young, fiery activist named Aung. He and his peers, the so-called 30 Comrades, would soon change Burma's destiny forever. The spark came with World War II. When Japan invaded China in 1937, Burma suddenly became strategically important. Its geography was a bridge between India, China, and Southeast Asia. Whoever controlled Burma controlled the vital Burma Road, the lifeline carrying supplies from the Allies to China's resistance against Japan. Both Britain and Japan knew this. For Burmese nationalists, the global war presented an opportunity. Britain had ruled them for half a century, but now Japan came with promises of liberation. In 1940, Aung San and his comrades secretly left Burma and traveled to Japan. There, they received military training and support, preparing to return as the nucleus of a Burmese independence army. In December 1941, Japan launched its lightning campaigns across Asia. Within months, they seized Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines. Burma was next. In early 1942, Japanese troops, together with the newly formed Burma Independence Army BIA, marched into Burma. The British, overstretched and unprepared, retreated in chaos. Rangoon fell in March. By May, the Japanese controlled nearly all of Burma. For many Burmese, the sight of British retreat and Japanese victory was electrifying. The colonial masters who had seemed invincible were suddenly gone. The BIA, hailed as liberators, raised the flag of independence, at least under Japanese oversight. For the first time in living memory, Burma was free of British rule. But the reality of Japanese occupation soon proved harsh. While they had promised independence, the Japanese treated Burma as a military outpost. Rice was requisitioned for the Japanese army, causing famine in some regions. Laborers were conscripted for brutal construction projects, such as the infamous Burma-Thailand Railway, where tens of thousands died under inhuman conditions. By 1943, Japan attempted to legitimize its rule by granting Burma nominal independence. Aung San was made war minister in the new government, but he and many others quickly realized that Japan's independence was a hollow gesture. Real power lay in Tokyo and with the Japanese military. Disillusioned, Burmese leaders began to shift their stance. In secret, Aung San reached out to the Allies, preparing to switch sides when the moment was right. In March 1945, as Japan's empire crumbled, Aung San and the Anti-Fascist People's Freedom League, AFPFL, launched an uprising against the Japanese. Burmese soldiers who had once fought alongside Japanese troops now turned their guns on them. At the same time, the Allies had returned. British, Indian, Chinese, and American forces, under commanders like General William Slim, launched massive campaigns to retake Burma. Battles raged in the jungles and hills. In places like Impul and Kohima, on the Indian frontier, fierce clashes that became turning points of the war. The Allied victory at Impul in 1944 marked the beginning of Japan's retreat. The fighting in Burma was brutal. Soldiers faced monsoon rains, malaria, and leeches as deadly as bullets. Villages were destroyed, civilians displaced, and famine stalked the land. By 1945, Burma was devastated, land of ruins, graves, and shattered communities. Yet through the suffering, a new sense of national identity had taken root. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, Burma stood at a crossroads. The British returned, but they found a country profoundly changed. The Burmese people had tasted both the brutality of foreign rule and the possibility of self-determination. Aung San emerged as the undisputed leader of the independence movement, respected for his courage and pragmatism. Negotiations with the British followed. At first, London hoped to gradually reintegrate Burma into the empire, but Aung San and the AFPFL pressed relentlessly for full independence. In January 1947, Aung San travelled to London and secured an agreement. Burma would become fully independent within a year. It was a historic achievement, won not on the battlefield alone, but through diplomacy and determination. Tragically, Aung San would not live to see his dream realized. On July 19, 1947, just months before independence, he and 6 of his colleagues were assassinated in Rangoon by political rivals. The shock was immense. For many Burmese, it was as if the nation's father had been struck down on the eve of birth. Yet the momentum toward independence could not be stopped. On January 4, 1948, Burma officially declared itself a sovereign nation. Fireworks lit the skies over Rangoon. The British lowered their Union Jack, and the Burmese flag was raised high. For the first time in modern history, Burma was free. World War II had destroyed much of the land and taken countless lives, but it had also forged a new reality, the end of colonial rule and the beginning of independence. The struggle was far from over ethnic divisions. Political instability and new challenges loomed ahead. But for one shining moment, Burma stood proud, master of its own destiny once more. On January 4, 1948, fireworks lit the night skies above Rangoon. Crowds filled the streets, celebrating the end of more than 60 years of colonial rule. Burma was finally free, an independent republic with its own flag, its own government, and its own future to shape. After centuries of kings, decades of colonial domination, and the brutal years of World War II, independence felt like the dawn of a new age. Yet beneath the celebrations, cracks were already forming. The new Republic of the Union of Burma inherited not only sovereignty, but also the deep divisions of its past, ethnic tensions, political rivalries, and the absence of its founding father. Aung San created an unstable foundation for the fragile democracy. The country's first prime minister was U Nu, a close ally of Aung San and a leader of the anti-fascist People's Freedom League, AFPFL. U Nu was a devout Buddhist, a gifted speaker, and a man of compromise. He promised to lead Burma as a democratic, parliamentary state, but governing Burma was no easy task. The most pressing challenge was ethnic conflict. Burma was and still is one of the most diverse countries in Asia, home to dozens of ethnic groups. During the independence negotiations, Aung San had promised a degree of autonomy to minority regions like the Shan, Kachin, and Chin. His assassination left those promises fragile. Soon after independence, many ethnic armed groups took up arms, demanding greater self-rule or outright independence. At the same time, communist insurgencies erupted. The Communist Party of Burma, which had been part of the anti-colonial struggle, split with the AFPFL and launched a rebellion. By 1949, large parts of the countryside were engulfed in conflict. Rangoon, the capital, remained under government control, but much of the nation was contested territory. Adding to the chaos, remnants of the Chinese Nationalist Army, defeated by Mao Zedong's communists, in China's civil war fled across the border into Burma. From bases in Shan State, they conducted raids and drug trafficking, complicating Burma's fragile security situation. The young government had to contend not only with its own insurgencies, but also with foreign armies operating inside its borders. Despite these challenges, U Nu tried to keep democracy alive. Elections were held, a parliament functioned, and debates over policy reflected real ideological divisions. But the constant insecurity drained the government's strength. Burma's economy, already shattered by the war, struggled to recover. Inflation, corruption, and black markets eroded confidence in the civilian government. Culturally, U Nu promoted Buddhism as a unifying force. He sponsored Buddhist institutions, declared Buddhism the state religion in 1961, and tried to use faith as the moral backbone of the new nation. But this move alienated Christian and Muslim minorities, deepening divisions rather than healing them. Throughout the 1950s, Burma's democracy limped forward, but instability never subsided. The AFPFL itself fractured into rival factions, paralyzing governance. Each election seemed to produce weaker coalitions, while the military, the Tatmadaw, watched from the sidelines, growing in power and influence. Originally tasked with defending the state against insurgencies, the army had become the most organized and disciplined force in the country. By the early 1960s, patience within the military had run out. Too many generals, Burma's civilian leaders seemed incapable of restoring stability. Ethnic rebellions continued, communists still held territory, and the government in Rangoon appeared weak and divided. General Ne Win, who had served as interim caretaker prime minister once before in the 1950s, prepared to act. On March 2, 1962, Ne Win led a coup d'état. Tanks rolled into Rangoon. U Nu and other political leaders were arrested. The parliament was dissolved, the constitution suspended, and Burma's brief experiment with parliamentary democracy came to an abrupt end. Ne Win declared that the military had no choice but to intervene to save the Union from disintegration. He promised stability, unity, and a new vision for the nation. But what followed was nearly 5 decades of authoritarian military rule, isolation, and decline. For many Burmese, the years between 1948 and 1962 remain bittersweet. Independence had been won with such hope, and democracy had been given a chance. But ethnic tensions, ideological divides, and weak institutions proved too great to overcome. Instead of becoming a model of post-colonial democracy, Burma became a cautionary tale of how fragile freedom can be when the foundations are unstable. The dream of independence had not died, but it had been placed under the shadow of military boots. When General Ne Win seized power in March 1962, Burma's fragile democracy came to an abrupt end. The tanks that rolled into Rangoon marked not just a change of government, but a fundamental transformation of the nation's political system. From that day forward, the military, the Tatmadaw, would dominate Burma's destiny. For nearly half a century, the country would be ruled not by kings or parliaments, but by generals. Ne Win justified his coup as necessary to preserve national unity. He argued that ethnic rebellions, communist insurgencies, and weak civilian leadership threatened to tear the Union apart. In his words, only the army could save Burma, but saving the Union came at a heavy cost. Democracy was dismantled, opposition crushed, and a new authoritarian ideology imposed on the people. Ne Win introduced what he called the Burmese way to socialism. On paper, it sounded like a uniquely Burmese model combining socialism, nationalism, and Buddhism. In practice, it meant isolation, repression, and economic disaster. Banks, industries, and even small businesses were nationalized. Foreign companies were expelled. The economy was cut off from global markets. For a while, this gave the impression of self-reliance, but soon, Burma slid into stagnation and poverty. Under Ne Win, dissent was not tolerated. Universities were hotbeds of resistance, so he ordered them shut down or heavily restricted. Protests were met with bullets. Ethnic insurgencies in the hills were fought with brutal counterinsurgency campaigns. The press was censored, and a pervasive climate of fear took hold. The once vibrant economy collapsed. By the 1970s, Burma, once one of Asia's wealthiest rice exporters, had become one of its poorest countries. Infrastructure decayed, education suffered, and millions were pushed into poverty. A country once called the Rice Bowl of Asia was now struggling to feed its own people. In 1974, Ne Win formalized military control by drafting a new constitution, creating the Burma Socialist Program Party (BSPP) as the sole political party. Elections were held, but they were meaningless. All candidates had to be approved by the regime. The facade of civilian rule could not hide the reality. Burma was a one-party dictatorship, run by generals in socialist uniforms. Discontent simmered for decades, but the breaking point came in the 1980s. By then, the economy was in ruins, inflation rampant, and corruption widespread. In 1987, Ne Win made a bizarre decision that would ignite fury. He demonetized most banknotes overnight, rendering people's savings worthless. Overnight, millions lost everything. It was a catastrophic move that revealed the regime's incompetence and disregard for ordinary citizens. The following year, 1988, Burma erupted. Students, monks, workers, and ordinary citizens poured into the streets in massive protests demanding democracy. Known as the 8,888 Uprising for its peak, on August 8, 1988, this movement shook the regime to its core. Millions marched in Rangoon and across the country, calling for an end to military rule. For a moment, it seemed that change was possible, but the generals responded with violence. Troops opened fire on unarmed crowds, killing thousands. The protests were drowned in blood. Ne Win stepped aside, but power remained firmly in the hands of the army. A new junta was formed, the State Law and Order Restoration Council. Out of the ashes of 1988 rose a new figure, Aung San Suu Kyi, the daughter of independence hero Aung San. She had returned to Burma to care for her ailing mother. Drawn into the protests, she quickly emerged as the symbol of the democracy movement. Elegant, soft-spoken, but unwavering, Suu Kyi captured the hopes of millions. She founded the National League for Democracy (NLD) and became the regime's most prominent opponent. The junta, seeking to quell unrest, promised elections. In 1990, Burma went to the polls. The result was a landslide victory for Suu Kyi's NLD, which won more than 80% of the seats. It was a stunning rebuke of military rule, but the generals refused to honor the results. The elections were nullified, opposition leaders jailed, and Aung San Suu Kyi herself placed under house arrest. The 1990s were a decade of repression and isolation. The junta, rebranded but unchanged, clung to power. Internationally, Burma became a pariah state, condemned for its human rights abuses. Sanctions were imposed. Inside the country, poverty deepened. The generals enriched themselves through illicit trade, especially in jade, teak, and narcotics, while ordinary people struggled to survive. Aung San Suu Kyi, meanwhile, became a global icon. Awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991, she was hailed as the Nelson Mandela of Asia. But inside Burma, she remained a prisoner in her own home, cut off from her supporters. The junta hoped that isolation would break her spirit, but it only strengthened her symbolic power. In 1997, the generals rebranded once again, renaming themselves the State Peace and Development Council, SPDC. But the essence of their rule remained the same: authoritarianism, censorship, and control. Ethnic conflicts continued unabated, with brutal campaigns against minorities like the Karen, Kachin, and Shan. Villages were burned, civilians displaced, and countless people forced into refugee camps along the Thai border. The new millennium brought no relief. In 2007, a dramatic wave of protests erupted again. This time, it was sparked by fuel price hikes, but quickly grew into a nationwide movement led by Buddhist monks. Known as the Saffron Revolution, the sight of thousands of monks marching peacefully through the streets captured global attention. Once again, the regime answered with repression. Troops raided monasteries, beat monks, and shot protesters. Hundreds were killed or imprisoned. Natural disasters added to the suffering. In 2008, Cyclone Nargis struck the Irrawaddy Delta, killing more than 130,000 people. The military regime's response was callous and chaotic, blocking international aid, hiding the scale of the disaster, and leaving survivors to fend for themselves. The disaster revealed not only the vulnerability of the people, but also the regime's indifference to their plight. Despite everything, the junta clung to power. In 2008, it pushed through a new constitution, designed to preserve military dominance under the guise of civilian government. 2 years later, in 2010, sham elections were held. The military's proxy party claimed victory, while Aung San Suu Kyi remained under house arrest. By then, Burma had endured nearly half a century of military rule. Generations had grown up knowing nothing but censorship, fear, and poverty. Once one of Asia's richest nations, Burma had become one of its poorest. Once a beacon of Buddhist culture, it had become isolated and broken. And yet, even in the darkest years, the spirit of resistance never died. Students, monks, workers, and ordinary citizens kept alive the dream of democracy. Aung San Suu Kyi remained a symbol of hope, her quiet defiance echoing across the world. The military era, from Ne Win's coup in 1962 to the junta of the 2000s, was a long night in Burma's history. But nights end, and by 2010, signs of change were flickering on the horizon. The generals, under pressure at home and abroad, would soon allow a limited opening, a transition that promised hope, but also new crises. By 2010, Myanmar had endured nearly 5 decades of dictatorship. Generations had grown up under censorship, fear, and poverty. The generals had survived protests, uprisings, and international sanctions. But the world was changing, and the regime knew it. Pressures were building from ordinary Burmese demanding change, from neighboring countries seeking stability, and from global powers offering both carrots and sticks. Slowly, reluctantly, the military prepared to open the door to reform. In November 2010, elections were held under the junta's new constitution. They were neither free nor fair. The military's proxy party, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, claimed an overwhelming victory. But even flawed elections were a crack in the wall of dictatorship. Days later, Aung San Suu Kyi, who had spent most of the previous 21 years under house arrest, was released. Crowds gathered outside her home in Rangoon, cheering, weeping, and celebrating. For the first time in decades, there was real hope. The following years saw cautious reforms. Censorship was eased. Political prisoners were released. Foreign investment trickled in. President Thein Sein, a former general turned civilian leader, surprised many by engaging with the opposition and allowing limited freedoms. The United States and Europe, eager to encourage reform, lifted some sanctions. Tourists began to return, and Myanmar, long hidden from the world, suddenly seemed like a nation reborn. In 2015, the unthinkable happened. Genuinely competitive elections were held. The National League for Democracy, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, won a landslide victory. Decades of struggle, sacrifice, and bloodshed seemed finally to have paid off. Aung San Suu Kyi herself was barred from the presidency by a clause in the military-drafted constitution, but she became the de facto leader as state councillor. Around the world, she was celebrated as the icon of democracy, at last stepping into power. For ordinary Burmese, the change was electric. Censorship eased further, new businesses blossomed, and international companies entered the market. Myanmar was no longer an isolated pariah, but a country of possibility. The people spoke of a new era. The long night of dictatorship was ending. But the transition was never complete. The 2008 constitution ensured that the military retained enormous power. 25% of parliamentary seats were reserved for officers, giving them an effective veto over constitutional change. The generals still controlled key ministries: defense, home affairs, and border affairs. It was a democracy with shackles. And then came the greatest stain on this era of hope: the Rohingya crisis. The Rohingya, a Muslim minority living mainly in Rakhine State, had long faced discrimination and denial of citizenship. Tensions exploded in 2016 and 2017, when Myanmar's military launched brutal operations against Rohingya villages after attacks by insurgents. Entire communities were burned. Thousands were killed. More than 700,000 Rohingya fled across the border into Bangladesh, creating one of the world's largest refugee crises. The world was horrified. The same Aung San Suu Kyi, who had once been hailed as a human rights icon, was now criticized for failing to stop, or even acknowledge, the atrocities. At the International Court of Justice, Myanmar faced accusations of genocide. For many, the glow of Myanmar's democratic transition dimmed, replaced by the shadow of ethnic persecution. Still, the fragile democracy staggered on. In 2020, despite the pandemic, Myanmar held another election. Once again, the NLD won a landslide victory, affirming public support for Suu Kyi's leadership. But the military, seeing its dominance threatened, refused to accept the results. On February 1, 2021, the Tatmadaw struck again. Tanks rolled into Naypyidaw, the capital. Aung San Suu Kyi and other elected leaders were arrested. Power was seized by General Min Aung Hlaing. Overnight, Myanmar's democratic experiment was shattered. But unlike in 1962 or 1988, this time the people refused to surrender quietly. Massive protests erupted across the country. Young people, many of whom had grown up during the brief period of freedom, flooded the streets, banging pots and pans, waving red NLD flags, and demanding the restoration of democracy. Teachers, doctors, and civil servants launched a nationwide civil disobedience movement, refusing to work under the junta. The military responded with its familiar brutality. Live ammunition was used against peaceful demonstrators. Thousands were killed, tens of thousands arrested. Entire towns in ethnic minority regions were bombed or burned. The country slid towards civil war, as old ethnic armies renewed their offensives and new militias sprang up in the cities and countryside. By 2022 and 2023, Myanmar had become a nation at war with itself. The generals clung to power through violence, but large swathes of the countryside slipped from their control. Millions were displaced. The economy, already fragile, collapsed under the weight of conflict, sanctions, and global isolation. Once again, Myanmar was a land of suffering, resilience, and uncertain futures. Today, Myanmar stands at another crossroads. The dreams of the 2010s of democracy, freedom, and prosperity have been dashed, but not destroyed. The spirit of resistance burns brighter than ever among the youth, who speak of a future beyond military rule. Yet the road ahead is dark, littered with obstacles of division, repression, and international neglect. The transition that once brought hope has given way to crisis. Myanmar's story remains unfinished, its people caught between the yearning for freedom and the grip of generals who refuse to let go. Myanmar's history is a story of cycles of unity and fragmentation, hope and despair, greatness and tragedy. From the ancient temples of Pagan to the mighty conquests of Banan, from the gilded palaces of Mandalay to the crowded streets of modern Yangon, the story has never been simple. It is a history written not only in wars and kings, but also in the resilience of ordinary people, who endured hardship and yet carried their culture forward. The patterns are striking. Time and again Myanmar rose to greatness, Pagan Taungoo, Konbaung only to collapse under its own weight or at the hands of outsiders. Time and again unity was proclaimed, only to be broken by ethnic divisions and rival claims. And time and again the people turned to faith, to Buddhism and their local traditions, to endure when politics and power failed them. Colonialism left scars that still linger. The loss of sovereignty, the marginalization of Burmese identity, the reshaping of society into one divided by wealth and ethnicity. Independence brought hope, but it also unleashed the unresolved contradictions of a diverse nation trying to find common ground. Democracy faltered, the military stepped in, and for decades the people lived under repression. And yet even in the darkest years, the spirit of resistance endured. Students filled the streets in 1988, monks marched in 2007, and millions rose again after the coup of 2021. Each generation has carried forward the dream of freedom, refusing to let it die. Today, Myanmar stands once more at a crossroads. On one side lies the path of continued repression, conflict, and isolation, a path the military has walked for decades. On the other side lies the possibility, fragile, uncertain, but real, of a nation rebuilt on democracy, inclusion, and peace among its many peoples. Which path will be taken, no one can say. But what is clear is that Myanmar is not only defined by its generals or its rulers, it is defined by its people, farmers in the rice fields of the Irrawaddy Delta, monks chanting in dimly lit monasteries, traders crossing mountain passes, and young protesters raising their voices against injustice. Their courage, their resilience, and their determination are the true constants in this long and difficult story. The golden spires of Shwedagon Pagoda still shine over Yangon. The ruins of Pagan still stand in silent testimony to past glory, and the hopes of a new generation still burn brightly, even in the face of suffering. Myanmar's story is far from over. It is still being written in villages and cities, in classrooms and battlefields, in whispered prayers and shouted protests. And, as history has shown time and again, even the darkest night eventually gives way to dawn. This is Myanmar, a land of contradictions, of sorrow and beauty, of resilience and hope, a land at the crossroads between past and future, between oppression and freedom, between despair and renewal. The world watches, history waits, and the people of Myanmar continue their struggle. The next chapter is theirs to write.